Hello, I'm Patricia Vanskyke, Director of the Lloyd Library and Museum in Cincinnati, Ohio. I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Fungus on the Brain, the Fascinating World of Psilocybin. The Lloyd Library was founded more than 140 years ago by three brothers who manufactured nature-based medicine. To support their research, they collected books and specimens about plants and nature. One of our founders, Curtis Gates Lloyd, was a leading mycologist at the turn of the 20th century, publishing works on the subject, acquiring books on mushrooms dating back to the 1600s, and corresponding with mycologists from around the world. Today, our understanding of fungi continues to grow, and mycology is gaining center stage in fields ranging from medicine to the environment. In our recent exhibition, A Foray into Fungi, a reoccurring theme over centuries is that fungi can help you and hurt you. Given the attention that psilocybin has received in recent years as a therapeutic treatment, we turn to Professor Theresa Culley to help us unravel the research and current legal status of psychedelic mushrooms. Theresa Culley is a plant biologist at the University of Cincinnati, where she teaches a popular undergraduate course on medical botany. While an expert on both invasive plants and rare endangered plants, Theresa is also mesmerized by the relatively understudied world of fungi and the immense role they have in our society today. Please join me in welcoming Theresa Culley.
So we're going to start talking about fungus on the brain. This is actually a image of a human brain, actually a female human brain. So you might look at it and think it's a fungal network. And I liked it because if you didn't know any better, you would think that were the case. So I thought it was appropriate to be talking about fungus on the brain, the fascinating world of psilocybin. So many of us here, and I was talking with several of you, might be complete novices when it comes to mushrooms, or you might be really, complete experts, if you will. So I'm going to back up a little bit, give a brief overview about mushrooms in general, some of the biology behind them, and then we'll delve a little bit more into what they actually contain and the impacts that those have on the human body. So with these mushrooms, obviously there's a variety of different forms. Many people are most familiar with some of them here. The turkey tails, those are the ones that I see a lot. Some of these are medicinal, so we'll be talking about some of these mushrooms in just a moment. And some are edible, just for food, a morel over there, for example, and some are completely deadly, and so they'll kill you. So you might look at this, and I have one of here that's extremely deadly. It's one of the worst on earth. It's called the death cap. And what happens is if someone consumes it, they might feel a little sick, start vomiting. Then there's usually a period of recovery. It's called false recovery. It's a few days, and then they get sick again, and they usually die from that point. So it's very deceptive because someone doesn't, it's usually days later, and they don't link with being sick with actually eating the mushroom several days previously. So mushrooms are really amazing, I think beautiful and just fascinating creatures that are just little chemical factories is what we'll be talking about.
Did you have the one that was really deadly on that screen? Or...
I do. Do you guys know what it is?
Yeah, that's what I'd like to know.
Okay, it's this one right here.
Okay.
Don't eat that. So some people think that one is like over here and try to, eat it. So really the goal is if you want to go mushroom foraging, you have to be very, very careful of what you're eating. And if you're going to be with someone who's identifying them for you, you are trusting them literally with your life. So you have to be very careful because some of these mushrooms, the edible ones, could actually be found right directly growing on or in with the other deadly ones. And so again, you got to be very, very careful with this. So just back up a little bit about the biology of these mushrooms, the fungi. This is, to me, is what's so fascinating about it. The actual mushroom itself is really just the fruiting body of the organism that normally is living below the ground. It's the mycelium. And so just every once in a while, it will produce that mushroom. So usually most of the time, we have no idea that that individual mushroom is even present in the ground because we don't see the fruiting body. Now, we know that fungi in particular are really important in, well, first of all, decomposition. We'll get to that in a moment. But here, they actually link up the root structure of different trees, different plants, shrubs in the forest, and they help move nutrients around. And so they're really critical for the survival of these other trees that's going on, you know, that we have in the forest. So again, there's a lot of these interactions that are going on below ground that we have no idea. We cannot see them, and we have no idea what's going on. Now, what is the actual mushroom? If you look at it a little bit more closely, it is essentially the mycelium that has almost felted together. That's the best way I saw a description of it. So it itself is a bunch of the hyphae that have joined together to make that fruiting structure. And again, the whole purpose of the mushroom, the fruiting structure, is to get the spores out because that creates the whole next generation of mushrooms. Spores are not seeds. Seeds are technically with flowering plants, but you can think of them as analogous, as similar. It's a way of getting their offspring out and starting new mushroom mycelia areas. So again, just reinforcing the fact, like you might go into the forest and you see some beautiful mushrooms up there, but what we don't see is all underground what's going on. This picture, I like this. This is, I'm showing you the network that is being formed. This is a petri dish. And what they did is they put a block of wood in the middle of the petri dish, and they put spores on that from the common stinkhorn mushroom. And what you could see is that they're now radiating out. And the common stinkhorn, by the way, grows on decaying wood typically. And so you could see this huge hyphal network that's going on. So again, normally we never see this happening. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes that we don't see. So mushrooms are just fascinating creatures. The other thing I wanted to tell you, if you don't know already, and this surprised me too, is that if we look at the relationships of fungi in particular, I always thought they were most closely related to plants, or they were a plant. Some people say that. They're not. They're actually most closely related to animals, to ourselves, than they are to plants, produce, and any other organism. So just really interesting. Again, these mushrooms, fungi in particular, is, I would say, is a relatively understudied, ignored for the most part in comparison to everything else type of organism. However, if you, after our talk, if you go around and look, you'll see Curtis Gates Lloyd, for example, was a huge proponent and wanted to learn all about fungi. And he wrote all over to different experts around the world. I mean, you could see here, where was it? Down here, he has some notebooks and some publications that he did. And so the Lloyd brothers, and especially Curtis Gates Lloyd, was a huge proponent of mushrooms. And so I think it's fitting that we're here today talking about those. So mushrooms are found, as it says here, in all types of habitats. And that's one of the really interesting, another interesting thing about them. You can find them, mushrooms specific to dung, in other words, poop, feces, right? These are oftentimes, they could be found in cattle dung in North America. They could be found in elephant dung in Africa, different locations. A lot of mushrooms you might find in grasslands. I'm used to seeing a lot of mushrooms in the forest where I do my field work, and, you know, a tree falls over and you see a bunch of like those oyster tails popping up. You could have, this is mushrooms growing on top of mushrooms. So you can have all sorts of things. You can find them, of course, in gardens, riparian zones. They're not as common in riparian zones, but you do see them all over the place. And then some are just totally strange. So if you don't know about it, there are some mushrooms that are actually in Asia are bioluminescent. And so they actually glow in the dark. And there's reasons for that we can talk about later. But that's one of the things they do. And then there's just some really weird ones. This is devil's fingers. And so this is a fungus, technically a mushroom, I guess you can call it. But, you know, if you're walking through the forest and saw that, that might be a little scary, but probably appropriate around this time of year with Halloween. And here's one called bleeding tooth. If you saw that, you might think, oh my gosh, something is hurt and bleeding, and it's a mushroom. So crazy things can happen in the mushroom world. So what I'm going to do is we're going to go through a historical perspective, because if you know anything about me, I love history. So we're going to pull back and talk about how these mushrooms, and especially the psilocybin mushrooms, how they entered our lives as a society. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about what these mushrooms are. We're going to go through the different groups of mushrooms that have this chemical. And then we're going to talk about what actually happens in our brains when anyone would take psilocybin. And then also we're going to touch at the end sort of what Patricia was talking about, delving a little bit more into the legality of the mushrooms. And you'll see that there's a lot of echoes of what's happening with, or what has happened with marijuana and cannabis, sort of following the same track. So let's start with that historical perspective first. So if we look back and ask, when is the earliest, our sense of the earliest use of mushrooms, this is one image that's been used. This suggests that in 9000 BC or around that time period, these are cave paintings that were found in a cave in Algeria, and this is the actual image on the left. And on the right is the recreation of what the scientists think it actually was. And if you look here, there's mushrooms that are surrounding the sides of the individual. And you could argue, some of these hands here too. If you look a little closer, the head looks a little weird. It's actually resembling a bee. Because honey was really important, is the idea in these communities. So again, this cave painting is one of our earliest representations that scientists have said, and to suggest that perhaps as early as 9000 BC, people were using mushrooms, maybe medicinally, but they were so important that they put them into their cave paintings at that point. If you look at a lot of the literature and a lot of the books that have been done, many people also suggest that these two images are also further evidence of the importance of mushrooms in past society. So on the left is Persephone and her mother Demeter, and Persephone is the one who married Hades, was taken, right, and was abducted essentially. And so there's a whole fertility rite, which in Greece essentially became a psychedelic celebration, and so a lot of things happen. But what's been suggested is that Persephone and her mother are actually exchanging mushrooms here. And then another image here is from a fresco in the 13th century in a medieval French chapel. And it's a depiction of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And this is the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And so the suggestion has been as these have been huge mushrooms. I'm showing you this here. I'm actually personally a little skeptical on this one, because I think in this case, these are probably little flowers that have rubbed away a little bit. And so they sort of look like mushrooms. And back then, depending upon the actual artist, this could have been the way that they drew out different branches of the tree. So anyways, I'm just saying you got to be a little careful. But these images have been used to suggest that throughout our more recent human history, that mushrooms have been used and depicted in art. However, our story is actually going to start with the arrival of Cortez in Mexico, which at the time was known as New Spain. And if you remember back to your basic history, so what happened was the Spanish essentially wanted to find a lot of gold and different things going on. And so different conquistadors and Spaniards came through. What Cortez did was he sailed over to here and came along, but eventually his army came in and battled with the Aztec Empire. And so I'm showing you these pictures because I want you to think about perspective. So these pictures are from the European perspective. So Cortez is coming here looking very noble, right? We have perhaps a slave, an indigenous individual here from the area who's shouldering the burdens. The same thing here. We have, Cortez coming in on his, all triumphant. And so this was the European perspective of, hey, let's go find this new world. Let's find out what things that we can get out of it, gold, fruits, what other things that we can glean from it and bring back to the old world. So what happened was in 1521, Cortez came and conquered, again, European perspective, the main capital, the Aztec capital. And so this is, again, another image, European, but it's showing us, here's Cortez coming in and all of his soldiers, and there's fighting, and there's little groups of, our Spanish soldiers here, the conquistadors. But then over here, we have the native individuals, indigenous groups, and they're all portrayed, pretty much the same way. So again, this whole idea is European dominance. But if we do something similar and we ask, okay, well, that's that perspective. What happened to, let's look at the Aztec perspective. And we actually do have some imagery that the Aztecs actually had different types of soldiers of different ranks with different ornamentation. So it wasn't just these, half, dressed savages, which is what the European perspective sometimes portrayed. But they had a very distinct society. They still have today. But this is some of the images that I found through the Aztec eyes. So what the Spanish saw as a conquest, and a, winning everything, the Aztecs, of course, saw as a massacre. And so essentially they were forced to take over, or to do whatever the Spanish had asked. So at the same time period, also the Aztec, and by the way, the Maya also fell to this this incursion of the Spanish. At the same time period, smallpox arrived in the New World, and the indigenous people in the New World had no prior experience with smallpox at all, so it completely decimated them. And this also happened in North America with our indigenous groups here as well. And so today we don't think about smallpox, at least I don't, I've never seen smallpox, but this is what it actually looks like. And so this is an individual, it's pretty a bad disease, ultimately usually is fatal. It is, today we know it's infectious, it's virus borne. Interestingly, the Chinese have always been ahead of everything when it comes to medicine, and they were actually doing inoculations against this back in the 1500s. Here in the United States, some of the early founding fathers actually were big proponents of vaccinations at the time against smallpox. They were thought to be crazy, but we now know it works. We have vaccines distributed worldwide. So smallpox was said to be eradicated back in 1977. So that's one reason why a lot of the people nowadays may not ever have heard of it. But we forget that this was a disease that just came in and decimated these populations. So what happened then, and this is important when we start talking about magic mushrooms, the Aztec and the Maya especially had all of this very rich cultural, religious, ceremonial history and connections with the world around them, including with the fungus, including with the mushrooms. And when the Spanish came, there was a huge push to convert them to Christianity, essentially to Catholicism. And there was there's good reasons on their side, of course, to be doing this, because they saw that it was, making sure that everyone gets to heaven and so forth. But the result was that the Aztec and the Maya, their belief system was essentially being crushed. There was a Franciscan friar, Bernardino de San Juan, and he came in 1529, so a few years after this whole conquest has happened. And he was interesting because he actually had a fascination with what he termed the native peoples, with the Aztecs in this case. And he actually took the time to learn what they were doing and to write it down. And so because of that, we have some of his writings that I'll show in just a moment. But typically what happened at this time is the Spanish came in, converted the Aztecs and the Maya, and they were really disturbed. You can sort of think about this if you channel like a Christian point of view, because they saw the Aztec and the Maya revering mushrooms to the point that they had essentially what they call these mushroom gods. They had little statues. And so this is from Guatemala here. And so what happened was that these were viewed as idols to pagan gods by the early Christian missionaries. And so they were actually destroyed. They would go in and crush, hammer these things and destroy them. But if you see a lot of these mushrooms actually resemble, this is Psilocybin mexicana. This is one of the first hallucinogenic mushrooms that was critical to their society. You'll notice that the cap there is very similar in structure to the stone ones there. So essentially, the Spanish conquerors just really had this adverse reaction to anything dealing with mushrooms, especially what they called the Teonanacatl. So the Teonanacatl is the native name for those hallucinogenic mushrooms that were used in their ceremonies. And so the Spanish were trying to crush it all out, essentially. So here's one of the writings from Bernardino, the monk that I told you about earlier. So this was interesting because he's trying to talk about how these mushrooms are used back at that time period in the early 1500s. So he says at the very first, mushrooms had been served. They ate them at the time when, they said, the shell trumpets were blown. This means sort of at night. They ate no more food. They only drank chocolate during the night because chocolate was a thing there. And they ate the mushrooms with honey. When the mushrooms took effect on them, then they danced, then they wept. But some, while still in command of their sense, entered and sat there by the house on their seats. They danced no more, but only sat there nodding. And when the effects of the mushrooms had left them, they consulted among themselves and told one another what they had seen in vision. So this is like, okay, this is this documentation of what he had been told and what he had observed. Now, this is only one view. The more proponent view, that was sort of the more obvious view that was going out, was again this whole idea that this was some evil ceremonial rite and had to be stamped out. And so there was the physician to the king of Spain was actually sent to the New World and asked to report back to the Spanish king all about the novelties of New Spain. And so he actually wrote a gorgeous book. And by the way, this is all digitized online, which is really fun. But in his book, he says, 3 intoxicating mushrooms cause not death, but madness that occasionally is lasting, of which the symptom is uncontrolled laughter. There are others which, without inducing laughter, bring before the eyes all kinds of things, such as wars and the likeness of demons. So there's this imagery of demons and evilness, right? And so since we're at the Lloyd, I got to tell you, the book is beautiful. So it has these representations. This is Helianthus annuus, so the sunflower, a New World species. They have corn there. And then you get things like this. The dragon, right? So back at the time period, there was still in the old world, there's still a strong belief in magic and dragons and things like that. So some of these missionaries who were really naturalists had to sort of toe the line because they wanted to report what they actually saw, but then they had to like throw in a dragon or two just because that was important. So you see things like that. So again, what we start to see in the literature of that time period is essentially there's a demonization of the traditional psilocybin use. And so this is another writer where it gets a little bit worse. He says they possess another method of intoxication, which sharpened their cruelty. For it, they used certain small toadstools. They would see 1,000 visions, and especially snakes. And in this wise, with that bitter victual, by their cruel god were they hassled. So the gods were hassling them. And so this is one of the images. This is actually a pictorial Aztec codex from the mid 16th century. And here is an individual taking essentially a mushroom. And this was interpreted as this is the god who's about to harass him because he's about to have visions. So again, this demonization of the use of these mushrooms is sort of connected to the Spanish intent to convert this whole group to Catholicism and essentially stamp out any normal use here. So again, this resulted in the near destruction of this really ancient but very rich cultural heritage of psilocybin use in Mesoamerica. So a lot of the individuals, they might say that they converted, but then they would go back home and they would have their secret ceremony at home. And then you start to see a mix of the Christianity and this ancient culture start to happen. So this is mushroom use goes literally underground. So these ancient ceremonies persisted in secret, and again, usually at night in someone's house. But the really cool thing is we start to see they actually become publicly incorporated into the Christian imagery, like I told you. This is Basilica. These pictures that I took. This is in Quito in Ecuador. And the main basilica there, it's beautiful. It's huge, it's European influence. But when you look a lot closely, they have gargoyles there that are of the native, like Galapagos animals. And so they've been inserting their own, perspective in there. So if you didn't know any better, you could be like, oh, okay, that makes sense. This is another case. This is a statue that was found, I think, in like 1492 near one of the temples, and then they have it was relocated, I think, to Mexico City, and then they have a copy in Washington, D.C., which sort of cracked me up a little bit, because this is the Aztec god of flowers. And so there's all this, if you just saw it and be like, okay, that's a statue. But if you look closely, there's a lot of imagery built into the statue. So here, there's most of these, by the way, are hallucinogenic plants and fungus. You can see the earrings. People, are saying that's the caps of psilocybin, one of the hallucinogenic mushrooms. And they say even here on the kneecaps, this is a stylized look at the cap of the mushroom itself. So I just think it's funny that it's in our capital, but we'll get to that later. Okay, so we're going to fast forward a lot of years. Really what happened up until the 1900s, really the use of psilocybin and these different mushrooms in Mesoamerica, where it's, again, sort of underground, behind the scenes. People are saying, oh yes, I'm Christian, but then they'd be doing something, elsewhere. It was their tradition. It was what they're used to. So that the point where that all started to change was there was a Life magazine issue in May of 1957. And in there was this article called Seeking the Magic Mushroom. And that article, the author was Gordon Wasson. And we have a few things around here. If you look, you'll see Gordon, I think it was over there. There's a book, Gordon Wasson. And he was actually a New York banker. And so he wrote this article talking about how he went down to Mexico and he participated in a ceremony about mushrooms. And this is in Life magazine. So people are like, whoa, this is like this reputable guy. I mean, he's a banker, he could be anyone. And he is talking about this. So there has to be something there. So the article goes into it, but you could see here he is eating some of the mushrooms. And then the other thing you'll notice is the imagery. If you see this. So they're in the middle of a mushroom ceremony. And you can see there's a crucifix here, and there's some pictures probably of certain different saints. Is probably what I see. And so again, there's this mashup of traditional use with these mushrooms along with the Christian imagery. And so it goes on, and it has, here's he and his wife were big proponents of these mushrooms, rare vision-giving fungi shown for the first time. People read this, they're like, wow, oh my God, this is wonderful. I want to try that. Again, remember 57, right? And so this is a time where we're starting to get, a lot of free choice and free thought and, those things going on. Now, the woman who actually allowed Gordon Wasson into her house and showed him what she did and allowed herself to be photographed was this woman, oftentimes just referred to as Maria Sabina. And here she is. And this is, I just cut this out of that Life magazine. This is Gordon's words talking about what happened to him when essentially he had a trip. So he says they were vivid in color, almost harmonious. They began with art motifs, angular, such as might decorate carpets or textiles or wallpaper or the drawing board of an architect. Then they evolved into palaces with courts, arcades, gardens, resplendent palaces, all laid over with semi-precious stones or glitter. Then I saw a mythological beast drawing a regal chariot. Later, it was as though the walls of our house had dissolved and my spirit had flown forth. And I was suspended in midair, viewing landscapes of mountains with camel caravans advancing slowly across the slopes, the mountains rising tier above tier to the very heavens. It seemed as though I was viewing a world of which I was not a part, and with which I could not hope to establish contact. there I was, poised in space, a disembodied eye, invisible, incorporeal, seen but not seen. And so you'll notice that when we talk a little bit later, the whole idea of flying up and being out of the world, but like observing it, is something that's very common in these types of experiences. All right, so let's get back to Maria Sabina. So she allowed this to happen, this Time magazine hit, and tons of people love this, and they came seeking her out. And so eventually, this is a quote from her. She says, I realized the young people with long hair, hippies, didn't need me to eat the little things. Kids ate them anywhere and anytime, and they didn't respect our customs. So now she's like, why did I do that? And in fact, she got in trouble. So the people of the town were like, why did you do that? And started to ostracize her. She got arrested at one point because the Mexican police said, and they're like, wait, all these people are coming to see you, like you're dealing with something. And so she was eventually let go. But by that point, it became where it was already like the cat was out of the bag. People called her the high priestess of mushrooms. And so they would have these displays about, they elevated her up almost into a godlike status. And she unwillingly was like, why did I do that? So that's something that happened. It sort of took off. That Life magazine article, people have argued, has speared off this whole essentially hippie movement of the magic mushrooms and wanting to, go on these trips. At this time period, you guys might remember this one. Professor Tim Leary, he was a Harvard psychologist, and he was able to try some of these magic mushrooms, and he was amazed by them. And so he was a very strong proponent of the unregulated use of psilocybin and psychedelics in general, LSD. He was all about, oh my gosh, this has changed my life. This can change society. Now you have this whole perspective. People can get along better. And so he was really much into, let's let's embrace this, give anyone and everyone the ability to use psychedelics. Essentially, he lost his job at Harvard, created his own company, and it did not end well for him. But remember, the other part that was going on here, people forget, is in the 50s through early 60s, there actually were some medical trials going on. And there were some valid scientists also at Harvard who were actually testing psilocybin and other psychedelics, LSD, because they thought, oh, this could help people. And they got all mad because Tim Leary was going around, hey, everyone use it. And then the government, of course, would come along and go, okay, no one can touch it. And so now all of that early medical trials just got completely stopped. Now, at the time period, if you guys know your basic ethnobotany, Professor Richard Evans Schultes was also at Harvard. And so they actually, there's a lot of you can go back and look, but they definitely knew of each other. Richard Schultes, he's considered, I considered him to be one of the greatest ethnobotanists. He believes in participatory research. So rather than just watch what different groups did, and he was an expert in Central and South America, he wouldn't just watch them, he would go participate. So he's like ayahuasca and things like that. He's like, let me try it, And so these two individuals sort of came to a head, and unfortunately, what happened was Tim Leary and some of his cohort and his groups, because they were so strongly pushing this open, unregulated use, the effect was then the federal government came and said, no, you can't do that. And so this was at the time when the war on drugs begins, right? Late 60s, early 70s. So Richard Nixon was one of the first who had, public enemy number one is drug abuse, and really pushing against that. At the time, other people were saying, wait a minute, we should be able to do whatever we want. And so there was a counter protest to that. The Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA, was formed in 1971 amidst this backdrop of the war on drugs. And then, of course, going further on, we had Nancy Reagan, and this is more my generation, when she was, there's all these things about this is your brain on drugs, and they drop the egg into the sizzling, pot, and that's, just say no was a typical type of thing. So now there's this big push against all types of drugs. At the same time period, you may or may not know, this is an interesting one, is the CIA was actually experimenting with psychedelics for mind control. This is true. So this was a top secret project called MK Ultra. And this lasted from 1953 to about 71 or 73. And this was led by Sidney Gottlieb, shown here. He was a CIA chemist. And he was testing LSD and other psychedelics. And the point was he was trying to develop a truth serum for warfare. You know, if you could eject someone, you know, an enemy with a truth serum, they tell you the truth, that'd be great. And then maybe you could do something and eject them again, or they would have amnesia that they ever talked to you. And so this would be wonderful. And so there's a whole group that did this. The problem was it was unethical. And so it involved a bunch of prisoners, including prisoners of war, people from other countries, people from our country. Ultimately, it led to what's known today as an informed consent policy. So if you go and you participate in a test, you have to sign a paper describing everything and saying you willingly are signing up for this. This was also, informed consent was also happened too because Henrietta Lacks, if any of you know about Henrietta Lacks, she was a poor Black woman whose tissue, without her knowledge, was taken from her and used to form HeLa cells. And HeLa is actually based on her name. And these HeLa cells nowadays are used all over the world, and they've done really great things with them. But her family, she never knew they were taken from her. Her family never knew it. They never got any money until much later. They're trying to rectify that now. But the news all came out about this, that the CIA infiltrated a whole bunch of this in San Francisco, I think it was. They gave LSD out to different people. It's true. Ted Bundy, I think, got LSD at one point. And so that's what happened. And so the government came and shut that down. So today what we're seeing is that we have small Mexican towns that are mushroom destinations for American tourists. And so you can go and you could see other things like that happening. And then you could also go to a psilocybin retreats. This is one, this cracks me up because it's like a mushroom house. So some are going to be serious, like this is a more serious one. And they talk a lot about the set and setting, and we'll get to that in just a moment. So you got to be a little careful. And then, just for fun, I threw an Alice in Wonderland. So if you look at Lewis Carroll's text, and there were a few, but there's all this imagery, and this is the original illustration. And then this, of course, is the Disney derivations of it, right? But there has been a suggestion that maybe this is the altered reality story was inspired by the author's own mushroom experience. Because if you think about Alice here, you know, she shrinks, she grows big, you know, all these different things happening that are sort of consistent with a psilocybin trip. But really, this was written in 1865, so I'm not so certain about that. Okay, so now let's talk just a little bit about some of the mushrooms. Psilocybin here, this is what it is. So it is a chemical, a psychoactive chemical. It causes the hallucination, mood. We're going to talk more about what these other effects are, but it is a distinct chemical that we know about. This occurs if you take the mushrooms either dried or fresh. A lot of people take them dried because it's easier. If it's fresh, you have to harvest them. And the psilocybin, just like any other chemical in a plant, it starts to degrade after harvesting. So there's a period where it's the most fresh. Usually, once someone takes these mushrooms, the effects happen within probably about the first 20 to 30 minutes, and then they can last 2 to 8 hours. And sometimes one of the effects is distortion of time. So people come out of it and they're like, oh my God, I was here for 2 hours or for 2 days. And you're like, no, you weren't. And so here's what it does. So we know that essentially psilocybin is enhancing our normal transmitters in our brain, our central nervous system, known as serotonin. Naturally, it's in our heads. So serotonin is really important for us. It regulates our body temperature, our sleep patterns, how we sense the world around us, our cognitive state, our emotional states, whether you're happy, upset, that's serotonin. And so just by the way, the actual chemical itself was first isolated in 1957, again, the same date as the Life magazine article, by the Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann. Albert Hofmann was the big one who invented, I guess you could say, who came up with LSD. So, but he used Mexican mushroom samples that our good old Gordon Wasson had given him, who wrote that Life article. So here's just briefly some of the different genera. So we have psilocybin. I'm just going to show you. I think I have 4 here. And the whole point is, I just want you to recognize that there's a lot of differences happening here. So in this genera, there's over 150 species, or worldwide, we know maybe 44 to 146. There's different estimates of how many actually contain psilocybin. They're found in, as you can see, soil, dung, wood, moss, and that's what they look like essentially. One of the ways you could tell them apart is if you take the cap and you put it on a piece of paper, the spores are actually released and they leave what's called a spore print. And depending upon the color of the spores, that's also one indicator of the identity of the actual species itself. And some of you guys might be more familiar with that. This is Psilocybin mexicana. This is the species that was featured in that Life magazine article. And you can sort of see the underside on the gills, what they look like. And this is just to reinforce the fact that psilocybin isn't found just in Mexico. It's actually all over the world. So these are the natural occurrences of the species. And if you look where we are in Ohio, there's probably some right around there. Panoleus is the next one. And this is only about 15 to 29 species. This is found in dung, so livestock droppings, including buffalo and elephant. Sometimes it's just in the grass, but little brown mushrooms. It has the gills here become sort of spotted while the spores mature. So that's a typical one. And then Pluteus is another one. There's about 500 different species in this genus, but probably only a few produce psilocybin. And honestly, we probably don't know enough to know how many actually do. These are usually in tropical locations, usually found on decaying wood. And that's what they look like. They're conical or convex, but then they flatten out and then they have pink spores. So that's one of those. And then our last one is Gymnopilus. And this one, you can see 200 species worldwide, at least 16 contain psilocybin, probably more, and decaying wood. And these ones are sort of pretty, I think, rusty orange or yellow, actually pretty attractive. But overall, this is just an image showing you the evolutionary relationships of all these different mushrooms. Psilocybin has evolved multiple times in this phylogeny, and these are the different species. And the point is that they're found in different areas of the world and different locations. So lawns, fields, hippopotamus, and elephant dung. I mean, it's all over the map. The other thing you might have heard about is that mushrooms that have psilocybin oftentimes will turn blue. So when they're damaged. And so this is a normal one. If they've cut it a little bit and waited a few minutes, and it starts to go blue. We now know why, and we now have confirmation. This is a lab where they actually did all the chemistry behind this. And I don't expect you to know this. I just put it up there to appreciate. There's a lot of work that went into that. There's 6 different stages where it starts with psilocybin, it's converted to psilocin, and then eventually it's converted to something else, but a side product is it becomes blue. So this is confirmation that when you see that bluing, it could be psilocybin. I'm saying could be because maybe there's another bluing conversion that starts with something else, but we now know that. And the why is unknown. Why do they go blue? And so again, this is just another picture of that. Okay, so I was talking to my students the other day in the lab because I was all excited about this talk, and I started talking about psilocybin. And one said, well, why? Why did they even do this at all? And I'm like, that's a good question. Is it because it wants, I always think, oh, it's because it wants its predators, to hallucinate, I guess, and forget that they're there. It's not exactly that. So it is for defense. So again, I told you psilocybin mimics serotonin. What happens though is in us, it induces hallucinations. If you're an invertebrate like a fly who normally would be eating the actual fungal gills and inflicting damage, it actually, serotonin depresses appetite in fly larvae. So it's actually giving out this chemical that flies then are going to consume and be like, oh, I'm not hungry anymore, I'm going to leave. So it is sort of a psychedelic on the fly, but it doesn't induce hallucinations. It makes the fly feel satisfied and they leave. That's pretty darn smart, I think. So this was work by Dr. Jason Slott at OSU just up the street. So finally here, we're going to move into psilocybin effects on the brain. And Again, I've been talking about the term psychedelics. And so I wanted to step back a little bit and sort of explain what I mean by psychedelics. So in general, this is a collective term that shows or suggests that these are substances that produce changes, as it says, perception, mood, and cognitive function. So what I mean by those things is it could cause hallucinations. For us, this is the interesting thing. It's a dissolution of ego. You forget about yourself. So you're able to step out of your own body. There's also this distortion of time. Many people report spiritual experiences, but the other thing here, and we're going to come back to this again, it's the set and the setting. So what that means is it's your mindset, how you go into this. If you are relaxed and you're curious and you're at peace with the world and you're going to use a psychedelic, be it psilocybin, be it LSD or something else, you're probably going to have a good experience. If you're in a setting where you're familiar with that, you're probably going to have a good experience. But if you go into it afraid, scared, you're in a weird area, you're with people you don't know who they are, oh my gosh, what's going to happen to me? You're probably going to have a really bad experience, what they call a bad trip. So what I want to do is just take a quick little step out. I can't show you about what a trip is like, and honestly, I've never done one myself, and I don't want to. But at UC, there used to be a faculty member called Dr. Alex Frazier, and he passed away in 2002. He used to be head of the department, and he was an individual who would go around the buildings and paint. So I'm told he had a heart attack or a stroke or something, and he had to step away from his job for a while, but he had this artistic bent, and he would just go paint around the building. Now, he studied the genetics of perception, how people perceive the world. And these are photographs I took of some of his artwork before they renovated the building and took everything down. Sad, sad, sad. But what he did was, there's a method to this. So I'm going to show you an image next of what he did. And he had a belief that if you look at one of these images here and relax your eyes, so I'm going to have you guys all do this. So get prepared to relax your eyes. The idea was that some people would see it rotate right, clockwise. Some people would see it rotate counterclockwise. Some people will go back and forth, and some people it doesn't do anything at all. And there's a genetic reason about that. Okay. So his idea was there's a gene that controls this. If you have one allele, you're dominant for that, it's going to go counterclockwise. If you're the other allele, you're going to go clockwise. If it's a heterozygous, you're going to go back and forth. If you don't have the gene, you're not artistic. So, okay, ready? Sometimes this works. So just relax your eyes and see if it moves. Has anyone seen it moving? Some people are saying yes and no. If you don't see it move, that's okay. I'll still say you're artistic. Okay, so how many are seeing it going clockwise? A few. Counterclockwise? Few. Anyone going back and forth? Few. Okay. And who doesn't see anything at all? There's a lot more. Okay, perfect. Okay, I'm going to show you another picture, and I don't know how this affects anyone who's epileptic. So if you are, close your eyes. But this is a still image. I'm going to tell you, it is not moving. Okay. So here we go. You guys see that? So to me, it looks like it's pulsing. I'm not going to stay there because that bothers me. But it looks like it's pulsing, but it's a straight image. Nothing's moving. That is our brain interpreting that image and making that change. Okay. So I took you on a little bit of that. So what happens with psilocybin is this. So we have the compound, you eat the mushroom, it goes into our body, it gets converted into psilocin. And psilocin is something that can actually get past the blood-brain barrier that protects our brain and can actually go into the brain. I told you it mimics serotonin, a natural thing. So now we're bumping up the amount, essentially, of serotonin. It's hitting all the serotonin receptors. So now we're getting that effect. Bufetin, if you've ever interested on that from toads and toadstools, some things, it also mimics serotonin. So that's how we know what's going on with the chemistry. So again, with the psilocybin experience, usually there's distorted and heightened sensory impressions. People report vivid colors, objects, morphing into other forms. Synesthesia, do you guys know what that is? It's where your senses get confused. So you might see something, but you don't see it, you hear it. Or music starts playing and you don't hear the music, but you see vivid colors flashing all over. Your senses get mixed up. So again, it intensifies emotional responses. And like I mentioned, you can have a good experience or a bad experience. So a good experience, again, is for your friends, you're in a familiar environment, you're likely to have a really good experience with this. You're going to see everything really vividly, but you feel at one with the world. Oftentimes people report floating out of the body, or you're disassociated, that disassociation of ego. And you could see everything going on and you feel good, you're one with life. Versus if it's bad, you could have a psychotic paranoia, panic, it could lead to all these different things. So if you go into it, that's that set and setting. If you go into it in a bad experience, you'll have a bad experience. People cannot usually distinguish between fantasy and reality. And so what I tell, especially my students, because it turns out more and more university students now are apparently trying to use magic mushrooms. I don't know why, but that's what I'm hearing. It is not a party drug. So you do not want to do this at a party where everyone's drinking, you try mushrooms, right? It's not going to go over well. So the interesting thing is if we look at the relationship or the impact of psilocybin, Dr. Tepe and I we love this graph. So this is an example of, on the x-axis, think of it as how lethal it is, how likely it is you're going to overdose. And on the y is the dependence. So at the very top here is heroin. You can likely overdose off of that. You're going to get really darn dependent on it. That's bad. Notice cocaine, morphine, nicotine, by the way, up there. And caffeine is right over here. But LSD and psilocybin are down here. So actually there's very low dependence and it's not going to be lethal for the most part. So for years, because of Tim Leary and a lot of all the past that have happened, we haven't been able to actually do anything with psilocybin. But the Johns Hopkins, starting in 2000, essentially they got permission. I don't know how they did it, but they were able to start studies working on the therapeutic use of psychedelics in general, and they were focusing a lot on psilocybin. So again, the research wasn't possible until then because of all the legal problems we'll get into next briefly. So currently they're studying and training professionals to use psilocybin for depression, PTSD, addiction, smoking, drug, all those types of things, but also to help patients with what they call pre-death anxiety, where if they're facing terminal cancer, it's a way to make peace with the world around you and to go into that with a much better mindset and have peace with the world. So again, the point though is that you can't just take mushrooms. This is part of a very regulated medical program. It has to be supervised by a medical team. There's a series of guided sessions, and it's part of a therapy program. And so this is an example of what they do. Again, they're trying to make it as familiar as possible. And so what they do, best in no or low light, no noise. So you'll see that usually people doing this have something on their eyes. They usually have headphones on. And someone holding their hand so they feel comforted. So they're going to go into this a really great experience, hopefully. So 61% of subjects usually report a complete mystical experience. 36% have a problem, bad trip. And a third of these reported that the bad trip, the dysphoria, happened the entire time. Many of those people are like, I'm never going to do it again. So that could be really important. And this is just a figure showing us that the connections, this is a person who hasn't taken psilocybin. This is the connections of their brain. And this is someone who has. And so the idea is that psilocybin is allowing the brain to make connections that it otherwise wouldn't. And here are, I'm just going to show you this one graph. We're going to skip through the others a little bit. This is some data showing us that they had 27 patients who were diagnosed with severe depression. And they gave them psilocybin. They also gave them, there was a group that also had a standard antidepressant. But before the treatment, all of those patients had the average of they were severely depressed. 1 week after receiving psilocybin, the average went down to mild depression, and then it continued for the most part. In 3 weeks, they're now getting up to moderate depression. In 2022, the Johns Hopkins noted that they had another study, and they said they actually followed these over a year. And some of the individuals kept at the same level. Some went back up, and they had to have another dose. So that's really promising. And I'm going to skip past this because we're getting a little short on time. Microdosing, I just want to briefly say this is something that a lot of people have started to talk about. And essentially what it is you take a small amount of the mushroom repeatedly over time. Usually it's only about 5 to 10% of the full dose. So it's not going to cause you to hallucinate. And this term refers to any psychedelic. But the goal is to have the mental benefits. So you feel satisfied, positive, your mood improves, you boost creativity. So a lot of artists actually are starting to microdose as well. People report the world just appears better, it's brighter, it's shinier, you're happier. Again, you're not having a hallucinogenic high, it's just the microdosing. The problem is that mushrooms can vary in psilocybin concentration. So people if you just cut off a little bit, like you don't know what you're getting. And the research is still inconclusive. So some research suggests this is just a placebo effect. Okay, so why does this work? We don't really know. What we think is going on, I'm just gonna put this here, psychedelics in general appear to reset the brain. So we get a whole bunch of stuff happening over our everyday lives that sort of compound. Psychedelics appear to allow the patient to step away for a while, step away from themselves almost, and to see the world in a completely different view. So sometimes they come back into that much better, at a much better place. So again, people have suggested maybe it's where self reside, and it causes them then to think about others, thinking about their past or future, the good things that have happened, not just focusing on the immediate present and something horrible that's happened. So again, usually it affects mood, people feel closer with others. So finally, I want to end on the legality of psilocybin. If we ask about legality worldwide, red means it's illegal. So you'll see in many countries it's illegal. Blue is legal, so Brazil. In some of those countries, you'll see some odd things popping up there. We're going to get to the United States in just a moment. I always thought it was interesting. You go to Mexico, and it's actually ambiguous, partially legal, or decriminalized in certain parts of the country. There are laws that allow for indigenous use of hallucinogenic mushrooms. So what Patricia had talked about earlier in the intro is true. So psilocybin and psilocin actually are both Schedule 1. And so this is the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, created these 5 schedules, and they're different levels. So Schedule 1 is the highest regulated one, and it says has high abuse potential, not currently accepted for medical use, and all these other things. So anything that's Schedule 1, technically in the past, like you can't even touch it, even if you want to experiment or study it for research. So that's been a problem. Remember, I told you that it's actually way down here, right? So that's inconsistent. Also, marijuana is over here too, and it's Schedule 1. That's the whole marijuana argument. So the ongoing conundrum is that now this is in the federal government. So the guidance for the 118th U.S. Congress said, hey, this is a written document. And so they say that there is the possibility that some Schedule 1 controlled substances, such as psilocybin and marijuana, may have medical benefits. So they're acknowledging that. But, and they acknowledge the fact that Schedule 1 really limits a researcher's ability to do anything with it. So it's only legal to possess and dispense those substances within federally approved scientific research, like Johns Hopkins. But federal law limits federal funding for such research. So there was a rider to the appropriations law of fiscal year 2023, which said that no funds can be used for any activity that promotes the legalization of any drug or other substance in Schedule 1, except, and there's always an exception, if there's significant medical evidence, but you won't get that until you study it, or a therapeutic advantage to the use of such drug, which you won't get until you study it. So anyway, so it's still a little mixed bag going on, but the fact that Johns Hopkins is doing it is really good. So just where we are right now, legality of psilocybin in the United States, it is legal for supervised adult use in Colorado and Oregon. the state, actually, they had a whole vote and they allowed that. States with decriminalized cities, you can see in blue, Washington, California, Michigan, and some of the others in the New England states. And you'll see in Ohio, of course, it's fully illegal. This is just showing you the time series. So starting in May of 2019, Denver, Colorado was the first who voted to decriminalize it. And it just sort of goes on from there. So this is just like the marijuana story. We're seeing more states and cities coming forward, decriminalizing for step 1, and step 2 is actually making the whole thing legal. March of 2022, Colorado made it legal. We already talked about that. October 3rd, Portland, Maine actually voted to deprioritize enforcement of laws against psychedelic plants and fungus. I'm going to skip that. So this is just an issue of state versus federal conflict, because the state is saying, or the federal government with Schedule 1 is saying, hey, there's no way you can possess these mushrooms, where some states and some cities are saying, hey, yeah, you can. So the suggestion, the idea is, does federal law supersede state law? So that's marijuana and abortion. So again, this is just right at the end. Patricia already talked about this. So there's a lot of parallels between cannabis and psilocybin. So both are Schedule 1. Both have Central or South American traditional use. Both were used in the 1960s and targeted in the 70s. Both are demonized in part because of negative Mexican stereotypes. And here's some of the original newspapers that came out with marijuana. And they're now found to be medically effective, and now they're subject of federal or state regulation. So the last thing is just a summary. So essentially, we've taken a journey. So we've started talking with a bunch of types of different mushrooms that have psilocybin in different parts of the world, but starting in Central and South America. We talked about how those mushrooms have been used traditionally in cultures there, but that was sort of crushed with European the Spanish coming over. We then were able to figure out what actually is causing this. What's the drug? What's the compound? It's psilocybin. Then that sort of got out of control and everyone started wanting to use mushrooms. And then the war on drugs was the reaction to that. Nowadays, we're to the point where we're starting to get to where we can start to experiment around more with the mushrooms. And they're actually being used nowadays in some therapy programs that have been approved by the federal government. So the whole question is what will come next. So it's interesting. I think we're going to be looking at more questions about legalization coming up. And I want to thank you for your attention. Make some acknowledgments. That's my daughter in a mushroom mobile we found in Alaska. We thought it was funny. And then what I'm leaving you here is with a few of the books. There's many books, but these are the ones that I actually really enjoy. So I'm going to stop there.
Thank you for joining us. Our programs are supported in part by members of the Lloyd Library. If you'd like to contribute to programs like these, visit our website at lloydlibrary.org. Check out more of our webinars on the Lloyd Library YouTube channel. We hope to see you next time.